The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden hue over the bustling parking lot of Westbrook Mall. Shoppers, many carrying bags and some with children in tow, moved from their vehicles toward the mall entrance, creating a quiet hum of activity in the otherwise calm afternoon. The air buzzed with distant conversations, the sound of car engines starting and the occasional honk of a horn as someone tried to navigate the packed lot. The parking lot was a mix of older sedans, newer SUVs, and an occasional sports car, each vehicle standing as a temporary home for its owner as they finished their shopping errands. Amongst the shuffle of people and the clang of car doors opening and closing, one presence was more alert than the rest: Officer John Stevens, a seasoned officer with over 15 years of experience on the force. Dressed in his standard police uniform, the heavy duty belt carrying his gun, baton, and handcuffs, Stevens walked with steady, practiced strides, his eyes scanning the environment. He wasn't alone in his patrol. By his side was Titan, his K9 partner, a powerful German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat that gleamed under the setting sun. Titan's ears were perked, his body tense but controlled. There was a silent understanding between the two, an unspoken trust that went beyond the work they did together. It was the bond formed through countless hours of training, shared experiences in the field, and a deep mutual respect. Titan trained to detect drugs, explosives, and the faintest signs of trouble, walked by Stevens' side like a second set of eyes. There was nothing he missed. Stevens trusted Titan's instincts implicitly, knowing that his dog could often sense danger before it was visible to the human eye. As they moved deeper into the parking lot, Stevens noted how crowded the space had become. It wasn't unusual for the mall to see a rush of traffic in the late afternoon, especially on weekends, but today there was a strange energy in the air. There was a restlessness, a subtle tension that Stevens couldn't quite place. It was the kind of feeling he had learned to recognize after years on the job, a gut feeling that something was wrong. Titan suddenly stopped, his nose twitching, his stance rigid. Stevens immediately slowed his pace, instinctively turning his focus toward his partner. Titan's eyes were fixed on a silver sedan parked near the north entrance of the parking lot. His ears flicked back and his body remained tense, his muscles taut with alertness. Stevens knew that look. Titan had picked up something, and the dog was intent on finding out what it was. Stevens stood still for a moment, studying Titan. The dog's behavior had always been reliable. If Titan's instincts were this sharp, there was a reason. Stevens' hand rested briefly on his radio as he assessed the situation, weighing his options. He could sense Titan's agitation, a deep instinctive response that indicated potential danger. It wasn't normal for Titan to react this way, especially not in a crowded mall parking lot where there were so many distractions. Without a word, Stevens took a step toward the car, Titan's leash now taut in his hand, the dog's gaze unyielding. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the world itself had quieted in anticipation of something. Stevens was about to call for backup when he noticed something movement from inside the car. The woman sitting in the driver's seat appeared tense, her hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled desperation. Her eyes were darting around nervously, and she seemed unusually alert, her body rigid and unmoving. There was a strange energy about her that Stevens couldn't quite place, but it set off a warning bell in his mind. Titan's growl, deep and threatening, filled the air. Stevens knew that his K9 was not reacting to a normal threat. There was something deeper. Titan wasn't just agitated, he was sensing danger. And the woman in the car, she wasn't acting like a typical shopper. Stevens' mind raced as he took a step closer to the car. His eyes locked with the woman's through the windshield. She was trying to maintain her composure, but Stevens could see it in her, the fear. It was the kind of fear that didn't just come from being confronted by an officer. No, this was something more primal, something deep within her that had driven her to this point. The woman quickly glanced at Titan, her eyes wide with unease. The dog had been barking relentlessly, his powerful voice breaking through the otherwise peaceful parking lot. But as the barks grew louder, she started to panic. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her face pale and drawn, her breaths shallow. It was clear she was afraid of Titan, but there was more to it than just a fear of a barking dog. Titan's instincts were rarely wrong, and Stevens had learned to trust his partner above all else. Something wasn't right with this situation. The woman in the car was hiding something. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Titan's growl echoed across the parking lot, a low, guttural sound that carried with it an unmistakable sense of urgency. The air between Stevens and the woman in the car seemed to thicken as Titan's barks became more insistent. He was no longer just reacting to the woman's anxiety. Titan had sensed something in the car, something that had stirred his protective instincts. The woman's face paled even more as Stevens took a step forward, his hand hovering near his radio. His gut was telling him that this wasn't a routine check. Titan's behavior, so out of the ordinary, was a warning. A very serious warning. Stevens felt the weight of the moment settle in the pit of his stomach. With a calmness born of years on, "The job?" Stevens spoke quietly into his radio, calling for backup. He didn't know what exactly he was dealing with, but he knew it was something big. His partner, Titan, wasn't reacting like this without reason. As Stevens moved closer to the vehicle, he could see the woman's hands tremble slightly on the steering wheel. There was no mistaking it, she was scared. But what was she hiding? Why was she so terrified? Stevens's eyes narrowed as he studied the woman further. She was visibly pregnant, though her appearance suggested something far more disturbing. She seemed out of place, her anxiety laced with a desperation that wasn't normal for an ordinary shopper. Her body language stiff, on edge, her hands clenched around the wheel told Stevens everything he needed to know. She was trying to hide something, and Titan was intent on exposing it. Titan's barking grew louder, more frantic, each bark echoing in the otherwise quiet parking lot. Stevens stood still for a moment, assessing the situation. Something wasn't right, and his instincts told him that Titan had already identified the source of the problem. The woman's nervousness was the tip of the iceberg. As Stevens moved closer, Titan pulled at his leash, the tension in his body palpable. Titan's nose was almost pressed to the car now, and the dog's sharp barks were joined by a new sound, a low growl that vibrated deep in his chest. Stevens didn't hesitate any longer. He reached for his radio again. "Back up now," Stevens ordered firmly. His voice was calm, but inside he felt the heat of adrenaline beginning to rise. There was no turning back now. The situation was escalating, and Stevens had no idea what he was about to uncover. As Stevens waited for the backup units to arrive, he moved with careful precision, his eyes never leaving the silver sedan. Titan remained fixated on the car, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to launch into action. The dog's barking had died down slightly, replaced by a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the air. The tension in the parking lot was palpable. Stevens could feel his heart rate pick up as he moved closer to the car, Titan at his side. The woman inside the car had become even more visibly shaken. She was sweating now, her breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. Stevens could see the way her hands gripped the wheel, the knuckles turning white with the pressure. Her lips trembled, and though she tried to maintain some semblance of composure, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Stevens crouched down to Titan's level, his voice calm and steady as he spoke to his canine partner. Titan's eyes met Stevens, and the bond between the two was almost tangible. Stevens didn't need to say much. Titan understood his every command without words. The backup units were close now, their sirens barely audible in the distance. Stevens didn't wait. His eyes flicked toward the sedan, his senses heightened as he made a decision. This wasn't just an ordinary car search. Something inside that vehicle had set Titan off, and Stevens knew better than to ignore the dog's instincts. With a deep breath, Stevens took a step forward, his focus entirely on the woman in the car. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with panic. He could see the fear in her face, but it was different from the usual apprehension one might expect from someone pulled over by a police officer. This was deeper, more primal. Something was being hidden. Titan barked once more, louder now, pulling at the leash in Stevens' hand. Stevens had seen his partner in action countless times, but this was different. Titan wasn't barking out of aggression. He was barking to warn. His growls were a signal, a clear message that there was something or someone inside the vehicle that didn't belong. Stevens made the decision. It was time to open the car. He motioned to the woman, asking her to stay still. As much as he hated the idea of escalating things, he knew Titan's instincts had never failed them before. The woman nodded, though her hands continued to tremble, her eyes shifting nervously from Stevens to Titan. Stevens moved quickly, checking the rear passenger door. He pulled it open and then moved to the back of the sedan, where he found the trunk. Titan's barking had turned into a full-on alert, the dog now circling the vehicle, his movements sharp and purposeful. Stevens opened the trunk with a single, swift motion, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the trunk was filled with old clothes, blankets, and what appeared to be a variety of bags. But as Stevens scanned the contents, his eyes landed on something that made his blood run cold. Beneath the blankets and the piles of clothes was a small, trembling figure, barely 6 years old, with wide, fearful eyes staring up at him. The child was bound, his hands tied tightly behind his back, his mouth gagged with a cloth. For a moment, Stevens couldn't process what he was seeing. His mind raced, but it was as if time had slowed to a crawl. The child looked terrified, but his eyes were locked onto Stevens with a sense of helplessness that made the officer's heart sink. Titan stood at his side, no longer barking, but his gaze was fixed on the boy. His posture protective, as though he understood exactly what had been uncovered. Stevens's fingers shook as he reached down and began to untie the child's hands, his movements quick but gentle. The child, though frightened, didn't resist. The moment Stevens removed the gag from his mouth, the boy gasped for air, his chest heaving as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. Stevens pulled the boy from the trunk, carefully cradling him in his arms. His heart pounded in his chest as he surveyed the situation. The woman in the car was still staring at him, her face contorted in fear and confusion. But Stevens could see now that it wasn't just fear of the police, it was fear of something much darker, something she had tried to hide, something that could not remain hidden any longer. As Stevens held the child, he glanced back at the woman. It was clear that her mind had unraveled. The child, her own flesh and blood, had been taken from a supervised visit. The woman's delusional state had driven her to this point. She had kidnapped the child, intending to escape with him, but she had been caught thanks to Titan. Backup units arrived moments later, their vehicles skidding to a halt around Stevens' patrol car. The woman was swiftly taken into custody, her hands cuffed behind her back as she was read her rights. Stevens stood there, his focus entirely on the child now in his arms. Titan stood beside him, his body tense but calm, watching over the boy with the quiet vigilance only a K9 could possess. The child, still shaken but now safe, looked up at Stevens with wide eyes. He seemed to realize that he was no longer in danger, that he had been rescued. The officer gently placed a hand on the child's shoulder, offering him comfort in the only way he knew how. As the scene unfolded, Stevens couldn't help but reflect on the incredible bond he shared with Titan. The dog had saved a life today. In fact, Titan had done it countless times before, but today felt different. Today, the bond between man and dog had made all the difference in the world. As the child was taken into the care of his family, Stevens took a moment to himself. He stood quietly, his eyes following the boy's family as they comforted him. His heart swelled with a sense of relief that the child was safe, but also a deeper emotion that he had long buried. He looked down at Titan, who was sitting at his side, calm now, his eyes alert but relaxed. The dog's unwavering loyalty and instincts had saved the boy's life. Stevens thought back to the days when he had first met Titan. He remembered the young German shepherd, a ball of energy and raw potential, just a pup back then. It hadn't been an easy road. There were times when Stevens doubted whether the dog would ever be cut out for police work, but with time, Titan had proven himself to be not only capable, but exceptional. They had formed a bond that was unbreakable, a bond that had been tested more times than Stevens could count. He thought back to the raid. Titan had been injured badly during one of their toughest operations. Stevens had feared the worst. The dog had been caught in a crossfire, and for a moment Stevens thought he might lose his partner forever. But Titan had fought through the pain, and Stevens had been there every step of the way, nursing him back to health. That was when Stevens had known that their bond went beyond that of a handler and his dog. They had saved each other's lives, more times than either of them could count. Titan had been more than just a partner. He had become family. As Stevens reflected on the past, he felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. The moments they had shared, the trials, the dangers, the victories, had forged a connection that could never be broken. It was a bond that was rooted in trust, loyalty, and sacrifice. Titan sat beside him, his eyes gazing out across the parking lot, ever watchful, ever alert. Stevens reached down and placed a hand on the dog's head. There was no need for words. Titan knew that Stevens was grateful, just as Stevens knew that Titan was proud of the work they had done today. The child was safe. The woman who had taken him would face the consequences of her actions, and through it all, Titan had been there, unwavering, ready to protect, ready to serve. As Stevens stood, he watched the boy leave with his family, the relief and gratitude evident on their faces. The child, once terrified, was now smiling, grateful for the hero who had saved him. The child's parents spoke to Stevens quietly, thanking him and Titan for their quick action. The boy, still holding Titan's gaze, reached out with trembling hands, gently brushing his small fingers through the dog's fur. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, Stevens realized just how much Titan had given today. The bond between man and dog, forged in the heat of battle, had saved a life. And it was a bond that would last forever. The warmth of the evening sun bathed the scene in a soft glow as Stevens watched the boy and his family drive away. The rescue had been a success, but Stevens knew that the day was far from over. He stood still for a moment, absorbing the silence that had fallen over the parking lot. The adrenaline had started to wear off, but his mind was still racing. Titan sat beside him, his gaze never leaving the parking lot. The dog's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the frenzy that had just unfolded. But Stevens knew Titan's calmness was a facade, a mask that hid the deep focus and sharp instincts that made him one of the most trusted K-9 officers on the force. The bond between Stevens and Titan was more than just a professional one. It was a deep, unspoken connection that had been forged in the crucible of countless trials. It hadn't always been this way. Stevens remembered a time when he had questioned whether Titan would ever be the partner he needed him to be. Years ago, Titan had been a green recruit, barely a year old when Stevens first met him. Titan had been energetic and full of life, but also impulsive and lacking discipline. He had a lot to learn. Stevens had been assigned to train the young dog, and at first, it seemed like an uphill battle. Titan had a natural instinct for detection, but he lacked the focus needed for police work. There were moments when Stevens had doubted whether Titan was cut out for the job, but he refused to give up on him. Then came the day that changed everything. The raid that Stevens would never forget. It was supposed to be a routine operation, a search for drugs at a warehouse on the outskirts of town, but it quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. Shots were fired, and Titan, who had been doing so well in training, was caught in the crossfire. Stevens remembered the moment like it had happened yesterday. Titan had been injured badly. He'd taken a bullet that had grazed his side, the wound deep enough that Stevens feared for his life. The dog had been knocked off his feet, but even as he collapsed, Titan had managed to crawl forward, trying to finish the mission. The scene had been chaotic. Officers scrambled for cover, and Stevens had done everything in his power to reach his partner. When he had finally made it to Titan's side, he'd found the dog panting heavily, blood staining his fur. His heart had shattered in that moment. Stevens had been forced to make a choice. He could either try to stabilize Titan and get him to the hospital, or he could continue the mission and risk leaving his partner behind. There was no question in Stevens' mind. Titan had saved his life more than once, and it was now his turn to save the dog. With a calmness that surprised even him, Stevens had scooped Titan up into his arms and carried him to safety, ignoring the chaos around him. Titan had been in bad shape, his breathing shallow, his body limp, but Stevens hadn't given up. He'd rushed the dog to the nearest veterinary clinic, praying that Titan would pull through. The recovery had been long and painful, but Titan had survived. It had taken months of rehabilitation, but slowly the dog regained his strength. And in the process, Stevens had learned something about the depth of his bond with Titan. They were not just partners anymore. They were family. Titan had come back stronger than ever, and their relationship had only deepened. There had been other close calls over the years, moments when Titan's instincts had saved their lives, but Stevens would never forget the day when Titan had proven that his loyalty went beyond just doing his job. It was about a deep, unshakable connection that would endure no matter the cost. Now, standing beside his partner, Stevens felt a profound sense of gratitude. Titan was more than just a dog. He was a symbol of everything that mattered in Stevens' life: loyalty, sacrifice, and trust. As Stevens looked down at Titan, the dog's eyes met his. It was as if Titan was looking back, as if he understood the depth of Stevens' thoughts. Stevens placed a hand gently on Titan's head, feeling the familiar warmth of his partner beneath his palm. There was no need for words. Stevens knew Titan had done more than just his job today. He had saved a life, and in doing so had proven that no matter the circumstances, the bond they shared would always be enough to carry them through. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the parking lot bathed in a soft twilight glow. The hustle and bustle of the mall had died down, and the air had grown cooler. Stevens stood with Titan at his side, watching as the last of the emergency vehicles pulled away, taking the woman into custody and ensuring that the boy was safely handed over to his family. As Stevens walked back to his patrol car, he glanced down at Titan, who trotted beside him with a sense of pride in his step. Titan's head was held high, and there was a quiet confidence in his movements. It was as if the dog knew what he had accomplished today, knew that he had saved a life, and that his actions had made all the difference. Stevens opened the door of the patrol car and sat down in the driver's seat, taking a deep breath. His hands were still shaking slightly, but he knew it was just the remnants of the adrenaline rush that had come with the chaos. He reached down and patted Titan on the head, the dog's fur soft beneath his hand. The two of them had been through so much together, so many high-pressure situations, moments where their lives had hung in the balance, and still, here they were, side by side, stronger than ever. Stevens could never truly explain what made their partnership so special. It wasn't just about the work, they were more than that. They were family. As Stevens pulled out of the parking lot and began the drive back to the station, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Today, Titan had proven that there was more to being a canine officer than just sniffing out drugs or tracking down criminals. It was about protecting the innocent, about being there when it mattered most. Titan had done that, and Stevens knew that no matter where the road took them, they would always have each other. For Stevens, it wasn't about the medals, the accolades, or the recognition. It was about the silent sacrifices made every day by his partner, the quiet moments of loyalty and trust that went unspoken. As the patrol car drove into the distance, Stevens smiled to himself, knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with Titan by his side, ready for whatever came next. The days passed, and the memories of the eventful afternoon slowly faded into the routine of daily life. But Stevens would never forget what had happened that day. It had been another chapter in the long journey of his partnership with Titan, but it was a chapter that was uniquely significant. Titan had saved a life, and in doing so had solidified their bond even further. It was moments like these that made Stevens truly appreciate the work he did, the risks he took, and the incredible bond he shared with Titan. The dog wasn't just a tool, he was a part of Stevens' family. And as the days turned into months and the months into years, Stevens knew that no matter where the future took them, he and Titan would face it together. The bond between them was more than just one of duty, it was one of loyalty, trust, and sacrifice. And that bond would never be broken. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story of loyalty and bravery, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Let us know what you think about the bond between Officer Stevens and Titan, and how you feel about their incredible partnership. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for more emotional, action-packed content.